Good evening, everyone. Good to see everybody tonight. There's Caden. Hey, Caden. Good to see you, buddy. Um, Good to see everyone tonight, and thank you for continuing to participate in this study. We're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 5 with the in our study of the Beatitudes. As I recall from last week, the last of the Beatitudes that we discussed was the third, that is, blessed are the meek. And so we're going to pick up with the fourth, and that is Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Looks like all of our normal participants are here, so we'll go ahead and get started. If someone comes to join us late, we'll be glad to let them in on the study at that point. As we've said all along so far in our study of the Beatitudes, it is impossible to separate one from the others. They are so closely interrelated and interdependent. And so as we as we go forward, there is inevitably going to be some overlap in what we have already said, and we'll try to demonstrate the interconnectivity of these beatitudes as we go forward. Um, but just very quickly, we have talked about the first, the poverty of spirit, the spiritual humility that is required, the mourning over our own spiritual poverty, the mourning um, over our own sin, the meekness, the ability to reign in ourselves and submit to the reign of God. And so tonight we want to pick up with Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Actually, I think we did talk about this last week. I, it just, I failed to make myself a note. But we talked about uh, recognizing our own spiritual emptiness and longing to be filled with what God has to offer. Because we talked about kind of the two aspects of righteousness, um, longing to be justified, longing for Him to make us right with Him, but also longing for to do what is right, not because we are earning our relationship with Him, but because we want to live in a way that is consistent with His righteousness. So, pardon me for um, the lapse of memory. Um, did we talk about any examples of this, of hungering and thirsting for righteousness? All right. I want to throw that at you because I think it's helpful to put a picture in our minds. When it's one thing to talk about these in the abstract, what the words mean, what we're describing, but at least in my mind, it's helpful as I read these to be able to call to mind a picture, and what I mean by that is a Bible picture, to associate them with a Bible character. And so when I think of someone um, who is poor in spirit, for example, um, I think of the Apostle Paul. Um, I think of and I connect that with mourning over sin. When I think about the contrast of poor in spirit or someone who's spiritually arrogant, I think about Luke 18 and the Pharisee and the publican. When I think about someone who's meek, the Bible gives us the example of Moses. I think Brian brought that up in one of our previous studies. Um, I think that's a really a really good example. So when we think about hungering and thirsting for righteousness, who comes to your mind? Who do you think might be a good Bible example or a Bible picture of hungering and thirsting for righteousness?
The Ethiopian eunuch.
That's one of the examples that I have in my notes. What about him, Alan? Why would you use him as an illustration?
He had made the long journey, I would say, to Jerusalem, though not under the gospel, but to fulfill or at least learn about the righteousness under the law of God through Moses, and was willing to listen and hear someone explain what he didn't understand.
So you have him acting on what he already knew. You have him reading while traveling, reading the prophet Isaiah in an effort to learn more, asking good questions when he had an opportunity to learn more, and then applying and submitting to what he learned. I think the Ethiopian is an excellent example. Who else? Jim Wilson. Sorry to say James because that's his name on the screen. Who calls him James besides maybe Vicky when he's in trouble? But Jim said Andrew upon first meeting Jesus. Yeah, that's a great example. Good.
I thought about the Bereans in Acts 17.
Absolutely. Yeah, good.
Searching the scriptures daily to see whether the things they were hearing were true.
Yeah, that's another example that I had in my notes. Good.
I guess you could include the Philippian jailer.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Good. The other one that I think of from an Old Testament perspective is David. And he could be used as an illustration for a lot of these, but in particular, I'm turning over here because I don't want to butcher this. Psalm 63. O God, you are my God. I shall seek you earnestly. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. And you see when Nathan the prophet confronted David after his sin with Bathsheba, and you read some of what are called the penitential psalms, the psalms of penitence, particularly those written by David after he was confronted with his own sin. You see his spiritual humility and his yearning to be restored to a relationship with God. Can you think of someone or an illustration of someone that you would say is the opposite of that? Again, sometimes it's helpful not only to see an example of what it is, but maybe to think about, someone who's not hungering and thirsting for righteousness. That's pretty broad, but can you think of an example in the scriptures that you would put in, describe in that way?
Would you say Paul at one point?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Before his conversion, when he's breathing out threatenings rather against the Christians, you see
he had no interest.
Yeah, no interest, very self-satisfied. Yeah, good.
In the Old Testament, King Ahab.
In the Old Testament, King Ahab.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, any of those. Yeah, Ahab is a great example. Manasseh would be another of those that are just. They're just. It's almost like they're doing everything they can to deliberately put a thumb in the eye of the Lord. And certainly we would say that. again, just to have kind of those, I'm not sure which one's more mature, Evelyn or Greg. Um, um, uh, Thank you, Greg. You completely distracted me. But again, just to have both those positive and negative pictures in our minds, to put, if you will, to put a face on the beatitude. Does that make sense to you? That's helpful for me. Maybe it is to you. All right, well, let's move on then to Matthew 5 and verse 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. I want to say something just kind of as a preface to this. The Beatitudes, in my mind, kind of fall into two categories. In one sense, our attitudes toward God, toward the things of God, and then the other is our attitudes that relate to others. Now, again, there's some overlap in there. Meekness is not just a quality toward God, but it also pertains to how we interact with others. Um, we we would certainly say the same thing about spiritual humility. But when we talk about mourning over our sins, that's Godward focus. When we talk about hungering and thirsting for righteousness, I think that's Godward focused. But blessed are the merciful seems to be one that focuses towards others, to show mercy, to be full of mercy. It's motivated by the mercy that we've received, but the idea is that we're going to show merciful. We're going to show mercy toward others, and it's not just some momentary, incidental, random, disconnected kind of display, but this is characteristic of the child of God, a kingdom citizen. Mercy characterizes their behavior. It's something of a habitual trait. They shall receive mercy. If we're not going to demonstrate mercy toward others, then we have no hope of receiving mercy ourselves. That's the relationship that is highlighted here. If you were going to describe mercy, how would you describe it?
Compassionate.
Compassion, good.
Forgiving.
Forgiving.
Isn't it really a merited favor?
All right, so you have this relationship in the scriptures between grace and mercy, that they are in some sense they seem synonymous, but on the other, but in a sense they're two sides of the same coin. And so mercy withholds judgment, or withholds punishment that is rightly deserved. It withholds that which we really deserve, so that we might receive, as Brian said, what we don't deserve. And so you kind of have both sides of that. Again, this is one that perhaps is easier to see in illustration than it is to describe in words. Who would you use as an example of one who shows mercy besides the Lord?
The Samaritan.
Absolutely. The Good Samaritan. And conversely, as one, those who aren't merciful in that story, the priest and the Levite, Luke chapter 10, they had an opportunity. And from a Jewish perspective, they would be ones who would have been expected to show mercy, right? They would be the ones that a Jew would expect to do something about the plight of those circumstances, not a Samaritan. but it's the Samaritan that shows mercy to the one who was beaten and robbed and left for dead on the side of the road. Others.
The idea, if we want our sins forgiven, we have to forgive others.
Absolutely.
Like when the one servant was forgiven a great debt by his master, then he went out and persecuted some other guy who owed him even less, and it all reversed on him because he wasn't merciful. He didn't forgive.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was turning in my Bible, Brian. Matthew chapter 18. The master who forgave the servant, and the servant who then would not forgive a much lesser sum of his fellow servant. So again, it's a passage in which you see that contrast played out.
What about Ananias in going to reach out to Paul after his trip to Damascus?
Sure, yeah.
He even responds to the Lord that he's not sure he wants to approach that man who's persecuted so many others.
Yeah, Ananias could have, from a human vengeance perspective, said, "Well, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity." But he didn't, and I think that's a really good example.
I get them all mixed up sometimes, but Joseph, when his brothers came back and he could have had him killed.
Yeah, that's a great illustration. Yeah, that's a great Old Testament illustration. So again, we see mercy is kind of one of those characteristics that may be difficult to put into terms, but we know it when we see it, right? We know what mercy looks like, and it's one of those things that we are so anxious to receive, but sometimes struggle to share. It's so closely connected with forgiveness, with patience. Jim says the prodigal son's father, great illustration. The compassion that he showed. The word compassion is actually used in that context, if memory serves me correctly. And we want it so badly. And when we don't get it from others, it hurts. But sometimes we struggle to show it. But Jesus establishes it here as part in the Beatitudes, again, on this fundamental. This is where Jesus starts. And if we can't get that right, then there are parts of the Sermon on the Mount that we'll never get right unless we start here. I think in many ways, just like, and I think this is, at least in my mind, maybe not an exact parallel, but I think it is a parallel, at least in some regards, with the law of Moses. Where did it start? The 10 Commandments, right? And in some ways, I think the rest of the law springs out of the 10 Commandments. The literally hundreds of ordinances. I think they all, in one way or another, relate back to the 10 Commandments. You might even say, in one way or another, they relate to what Jesus said are the first 2 commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? Jesus said, on these hang all the law and the prophets. In some ways, I would suggest that the Sermon on the Mount, and for that matter, all of the New Testament, in many ways, connects back to the Beatitudes. And again, I think you could say connects back to what Jesus said are the first and second great commandments. But they connect here. All right. Anything else about blessed are the merciful. Can get carried away and camp out on something. But is there anything else you would say about that? All right, verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Let me talk about the blessing. First of all, the idea of seeing God, the idea of, I think there's kind of two parts to that. One is the sense of seeing him now, in the sense of fellowship with him now, but then certainly the idea of seeing him in and being with him for eternity. Psalm 24, 3 and 4. Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to falsehood and has not sworn deceit. Again, the idea of fellowship, of ascending to be with God. And there, David speaks of a pure heart. So what does it mean to be pure in heart?
Well, when I think of the idea of purity, it's you don't want to be tainted by anything.
Okay.
And when I think of this specifically pure in heart, we have such a deliberate, intentional focus on God and the things of God that we don't let anything taint us from what he wants us to do.
All right. So it's not just purity of behavior. It's not just being undefiled in what we do, but you use the word focus. And that is, it is an internal purity first. It is an utter sincerity. It is a single-mindedness. It's not a heart that is divided in its loyalty or in its devotion. It's pure in heart. I'm looking at the way some others described this: honest, absolutely honest, and single of heart toward God, spiritually clean, innocent, sincere, unadulterated, undefiled, unmixed. So I didn't put this in my notes, so may take me just a second to put my finger on it. But isn't it James 1? Yeah, James 1 and verse 8 speaks of a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Ephesians chapter 4, Paul talks about the spiritually immature, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. And so you have these pictures of instability, right? Of divided loyalty, of people who don't have hearts, minds solidly fixed on God. And so, yeah, Jim commented again, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Proverbs 23, verse 7. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the heart from which the behavior springs. Even just a few verses down here in Matthew 5, Jesus talks about, no, I'm sorry, it's Matthew 6, verse 24. No man can serve two masters, right? And that's the idea here. He'll either hate the one, love the other, be devoted to one, despise the other. Specifically, Jesus applies that to God and wealth, or God and mammon, in that passage. But again, that's what he's describing there, is having undivided loyalty. Just above that, verse 19, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up for yourself treasure in heaven, where your heart sorry, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so just over and over again, we have this idea of heart. And that's the way the Bible, one of the ways that Bible uses the word heart is to speak of the spiritual center of man. Sometimes it's used synonymously with mind, or the will of man, but I think just as the heart is the physical center of physical man, the spiritual heart is the spiritual center of man. It's ultimately the driving force, right? Physical heart dies, body dies. Spiritual heart dies, spirit dies. And that's, and so having a spiritual heart that's pure, it's not divided, it's not being pulled in different directions, but it's loyal, it's not corrupted by other devotions. Again, we can think of Bible examples. Kind of by contrast, you think about the scribes and Pharisees, who Jesus repeatedly described in Matthew 23 as hypocrites, right? They weren't pure in heart. They wanted the praise of men. They wanted to be perceived as one thing, but they really weren't operating out of a pure and undivided loyalty to the Lord. But by contrast, I love what's said of Daniel in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel set his heart that he would not defile himself. Right? You remember the picture of Daniel chapter 1. Daniel is a Jewish captive, been taken to Babylon, and he's been put in, he among other Jewish youths have been put into the king's court, and all of the king's delicacies are available to him. And David says, or rather Daniel says, okay, that's not clean food, and I'm not going to defile myself. Daniel set his heart. Newer translations say he made up his mind. Again, yeah, that's the idea, but I love the idea of setting your heart to not be defiled. And again, we see the very practical outgrowth of that, the behavior that comes from it. And it comes from where we've set our heart. All right. Other examples or other comments about the purity of heart? So that really speaks to, in some ways, our attitude, certainly toward God, but also toward ourselves. The determination that we're going to make about ourselves. All right, then let's talk about Matthew 5 and verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God, children of God, in relationship with God. Blessed are the peacemakers. What are we talking about? What does Jesus mean? What does it mean to be a peacemaker?
If you make peace with God, you become a son of God.
I'm sorry. Say that again, Brian.
You make peace with God, become a son of God.
All right. First, to be at peace with God, that we might be a son of God. Good. So let's unpack that for just a moment. How is it that we make peace with God?
Become spiritual.
Okay.
Spiritual
Spiritual is what we're talking about, right? But how is it that we come to be at peace with God?
Obedience.
Yeah, it's by being submissive, right? Not hostile, not combative, not pushing back, but submitting. All right, so think about this, and this is not so much a Well, let me just ask, how is it that two parties can be at peace with one another? Just any two parties. How is it that two parties can be at peace with one another?
You can agree.
All right. So it could be a negotiated peace, right? It could be that you've agreed. Maybe this side has given a little, this side has given a little, and they've negotiated a peace settlement. That's kind of, it's what the world might call diplomacy, right? It's a diplomatic solution. It's a negotiated peace, a compromised peace. All right. So that's one way. What's another way? One might impose or force their will on another. They might impose peace. That was, by the way, Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. That was the Roman Empire way to peace. Was we were going to subjugate you. We were going to be at peace because Rome was going to be in charge. And so that's the Pax Romana. That's the peace of Rome. And so you could be at peace with someone because the stronger power has imposed upon the other, right? That's a very tenuous peace. That's a very strained peace, but it's peace. We might actually call that a stalemate, right? In some sense, because you got two forces working against each other, and one's overpowered the other, and so there's peace, but it's because this one has imposed upon that one, right? The other side of Pax Romana, or peace of Rome, was you could voluntarily subject yourselves to Rome. And so it was, all right, either you can submit or we'll force you to submit, right? So it could be that, the weaker party just kind of waves the white flag and says, all right, look, I can't compete with you, and so I'm just going to submit because I realize that's what's in my best interest. All right. Those are kind of the three levels on which peace is accomplished: a diplomatic solution, kind of a negotiated peace, a peace that's imposed by the stronger party against the will of the weaker party, or the weaker party saying, listen, I know you're stronger and I'm not going to try to fight you. I'm just going to surrender. I'm going to submit. Right? I don't know of any other way that peace is accomplished. Now, there's maybe various nuances and variations on those themes, but that's really all there is. If I'm going to have peace with God, how is that going to be accomplished? Because I force my will on him? Well, no, the weaker doesn't force his will on the stronger. He might try. We might attempt that, but that's foolish, to say the very least. Is it going to be because God imposes his will on us? He forces us into subjection to him? No. The scriptures say that God's people will be free will offerings. They'll be volunteers. They'll be God's people because they agree to be God's people. Is it going to be because God negotiates with us and says, listen, what do you want out of this relationship? What are you willing to give? All right, well, if you're willing to do that, then I'll loosen this requirement. Is that how it works? No, that only leaves one option in my view. And that is, if we're at peace with God, it's going to be because we realize that we're the weaker party, and we're just going to have to say, you know what, God, you win. And I may not like everything that you require of me. I may not understand some of it, but you win. That's the only way I'm going to be at peace with God. And it's not because God is some big bad bully. that he's somehow, he's somehow the villain in this scenario. He's God. I'm not. He's creator. That gives him the position of ultimate authority. And I need to learn to submit to that, to be in subjection to that. And so, again, to be a son of God, to be a child of God, requires that I submit to him because he's the Father. I think that would be really the more apt illustration when we talk about being sons or children of God. Make peace with God because as a child, I'm going to say he's the Father, and he brought me into this world, and he's the one that is in charge, and it's my responsibility to submit. All right, very quickly, what's the other side of peacemaking?
With men, with others.
Being at peace with others. And we're down to less than a minute here, so we don't have time to talk about that tonight. So you all can help remind me, since I'm obviously prone to forget where we leave off. But we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next Wednesday night. We'll talk about being a peacemaker with men. All right. Anybody want the final word in the last maybe 30 seconds that we have? All right.
Evelyn wants to wave at her.
All right. Everybody have a great rest of the week. Thank you for studying with me and for participating in this. And Lord willing, we'll see everybody on Sunday morning. Y'all take care. Good night.
Good night.
Night.